Chapter 6 of The Adventures of Joel Pepper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Elijah Fisher. The Adventures of Joel Pepper by Margaret Sidney. Chapter 6 Abram's Birthday Party. The robbers were caught and were lodged in the country jail, and all the farmers who had hen roost robbed, and the farmers' wives their doughnuts stolen, kept coming over to the little brown house or stopping Mrs. Pepper after church on Sunday to thank her for what her boy had done, until it got so that when Joel saw a bonnet coming along the dusty road or a wagon stop in front, he would run and hide. "I won't have 'em put their hands on my head and call me a good boy," he cried, shaking his black hair viciously. "I'll kick 'em, so there!" So one day, when he caught sight of a wagon just about to stop, he ran usual as fast as he could off over to Grandma Bascom's. "Now that's too bad," said a big tall woman, who got out of her wagon and made her way up to the door. "For Miss Beebe said in particular I was to bring Joel, and he ain't home." "Go and call him, Polly," said Mrs. Pepper. "Come in, won't you, and sit down?" Phronsie tried to forward a chair, while Polly ran back out of the door, calling, "Joel, Joel!" "Bless my heart!" exclaimed the visitor, looking at Phronsie. "No, I can't sit. I've got to keep an eye on that horse." And Mrs. Beebe, who ran over to the little shop up in the town, owned a horse that nothing but a whip could make go. This seemed unnecessary, however. Mrs. Pepper only smiled hospitably while the woman went on. "You see, I've only just about come, as 'twere from the West, and bein' my boy's birthday, and him bein' grandson, as you may say, to Miss Beebe, she thought she'd give him a party." "Oh, are you Mrs. Beebe's daughter?" said Mrs. Pepper in perplexity. "I thought the old people hadn't any children." "No more they ain't," said the visitor, leaning composedly against the door jamb and keeping her eye on the horse. "But, as you may say, Abram's their grandson, and her husband's mother was sister to Mrs. Beebe's, and she's dead, so you see it's next to kin, and it comes in handy to call her Grandma." "Oh, yes," said Mrs. Pepper. "Well, ain't so Mrs. Beebe goin' to have give Abram a party? La! She's been bakin' doughnuts all this mornin'. Got up at 4 o'clock and begun. I never saw such sugar ones. They're sights, I tell you." Polly now ran in. "I can't find Joel, Mamsie," she said sadly. "Well, Mrs. Beebe said I was to bring him most particular. She'd rather see him than any of the rest of you," she said. "Marthy'll be sure to bring that boy who was so brave about them robbers. Tell him I made some doughnuts special for him." "Oh, dear!" exclaimed Polly, clasping her hands. "Whatever can we do, Mamsie, to find him?" "You must not wait any longer," said Mrs. Pepper, remembering how the day before Joel had run to the brook and had been gone for hours, following along its course, never coming till dinner time. "Get Phronsie ready, and Davie, and yourself, but I'm sorry for Joel to lose that treat," she said sadly. "So I am," said Abram's mother, "and Mrs. Beebe'll find dreadful bad. Well, I'm afraid that horse'll start, so I'll get in, and you can all come out when you get ready for 'em." Pretty soon Polly emerged from the bedroom with a sad look on her rosy face, and her brown eyes drooped as she led Phronsie along as fresh and sweet as a rose already. "'Tisn't nice a bit to go without Joel, Mamsie," said Polly, discontentedly. "You can't help it, Polly," replied her mother, "and it won't do to keep Abram's mother waiting. So go on and take care of the children, and see that they behave nicely. And don't let Phronsie eat more than one doughnut. And be careful to tie the shawl over her when she comes home." "I'll remember, Mamsie," said Polly, and wishing there wasn't such a thing in the world as a party, she put Phronsie into the wagon and climbed up beside her. Davie, with a very sober face at thought of leaving Joel behind, craned his neck and watching for him as long as the little brown house was in sight. "You see," said Abram's mother, twitching the reins, when at last the horse decided to start, "I'd hurry away and get in. I should like to see set and passed the time all day longer with your Ma, but I didn't darst to. It's dreadful to have a horse run. I couldn't never catch him in all this world, stout as I be. Land, I hain't run a step for 10 yards. Crept the last spring. I was to Sister Jane's, and her cow took after me, and I had to." "Oh, dear," breathed Phronsie, turning her face up as she squeezed between Abram's mother and Polly. "Did he hurt you?" "Bless your heart!" exclaimed the woman, beaming at her. "No, for he didn't catch me. You see, I had on a red shawl, and the critter didn't like it." "Oh," said Phronsie. "No, so there, easy you," cried Abram's mother, holding the old leather reins as tightly as possible and racing back. "I guess it won't run, bean's I'm so strong in my hands. Well, you see, Jane, she rolled out the window. 'Throw away your shawl, M'ree, he'll kill you.'" "Oh, dear me!" exclaimed Phronsie. "And did he kill you, Mrs. Big Woman?" she asked anxiously. "No, why, here I be," said Abram's mother, with a hearty laugh. "Well, how could I throw off my shawl and me a runnin' so, and 'twas all pinned across me, and my brother brought it from over the seas, so I had to run." Phronsie sighed and kept her troubled eyes raised to the big face above her. "The first thing ever I knew, and I went down kerslump into a big compost heap, and—" "What is a compost heap?" asked Davie, getting up to stand in the wagon back of them. "Oh, manure and such, all gone to rot," said Abram's mother. "Oh, dear me," said Davie. "And the cow, 'twas a bull, I forgot to tell you. Jane's husband told me afterwards. He kept right on over my head. Couldn't you stop, you know? And he went bang up against a tree on the other side and knocked him flat." "Did it hurt him?" asked Phronsie in a sorry tone. "I s'pose so," said Abram's mother, "for he didn't know nothin', and the men folks came who'd see him runnin' and heard Jane rollin' and took him off before he came to, which after a spell, as lively as a cricket, and they dragged me up more dead than alive, and I hain't run a step since." Phronsie drew a long breath of relief that no one was killed, and Davie gazed at Abram's mother in great satisfaction. "Tell us some more," he said. "And I might as well have flung off that red shawl," she went on, ignoring his request. if I could got out the pen, for it was all smudged up, fallen in the mess, and I couldn't put it on. It beats all how you never know what's best to do. But then, says I, you've no call to worry afterwards, if you decide in a hurry. So now, go easy, you." And at that last they drew up at Mrs. Beebe's door. There she stood in the doorway, in a cap with a new pink ribbons. And old Mrs. Beebe was just a little black, smiling and rubbing her hands, and in the little window where the shoes and rubbers and slippers were hanging was a big round place plastered up against the small plains of grass. "There's Ab'm now," exclaimed his mother proudly. "I guess when you see him you'll say there never was such a boy. Well, I'm glad we're here safe and sound, and this ain't a run or nothin'. Now hop out," which injection was not needed. Good Mrs. Beebe ran her eye over the little bunch of the Peppers as they jumped down over the wheel. "Why, where's Joel?" she cried. In the bottom of the I s'pose," she added, laughing and shaking her fat sides. "Yes, where's Joel?" cried Mrs. Beebe, rubbing her hands together harder than ever. "I want him to tell me all about how he catched them robbers." Polly was just going to tell all about Joel, and why he couldn't come, when the big woman shouted out they couldn't find him, for he weren't home. "So now that's too bad," ejaculated Mrs. Beebe, dreadfully disappointed. Mrs. Beebe already had Phronsie in her arms, and was whispering to her some of the delights to come. Will, cut right in, all of you, and make yourselves to home. I'll take care of the horse. Martha, go in and set down." "I'm sure I'm too bad," said Martha, getting over the little steps quickly after the Pepper children, and nearly knocking down David, who came last. "Ab'm, come in here and make your manners," she called. Ab'm got down from the pile of boxes where he had been looking out of the window, and slouched forward, his finger in his mouth. "Speak up pretty now," said his mother, pulling his jacket down with a twitch, and looking at him admiringly. "These children's come to your party. Say, how do you do, and you're glad to see 'em." "How do you do, and you're glad to see 'em?" "Land sakes alive!" cried his mother, with a shake. "Ain't you more manners 'n that? Do you say it right?" "You told me to say it so," said Ab'm doggedly. "No, I didn't," restored his mother, with another shake. The little bunch of Peppers turned quite pale, and scarcely breathed. "Did anybody ever see such a boy? And he's that had no pains spared in his bringin' up. Well, he's 10 to-day, thank fortune, and he'll soon be takin' care o' himself." Phronsie crept closer to Polly. "Take me home," she said. "I want Mammy." "O dear me," thought Polly, "whatever shall I do? It will make dear Mr. and Mrs. Beebe feel so badly if I don't stop her. Phronsie," and she drew her off one side of the shop, old Mrs. Beebe having gone into the inner room, "you know Mamsie told us all to be good." "Yes," said Phronsie, her lips quivering, and the tears beginning to come in her blue eyes. "Well, it would just about to make dear Mrs. Beebe and Mr. Beebe sick to have you feel badly and go home." Would it? Asked Phronsie, swallowing hard. Yes, said Polly, decidedly. It would. People never go to a party and then they say, I must go home. Don't they, Polly? Asked the little girl. No, said Polly, decidedly. I never heard of such a thing. And just think, Phronsie Pepper, how Mamsie would look. Oh, you can't mean to be a naughty girl, can't you, poor Phronsie? I won't be a naughty girl, Polly, promised Phronsie, battling with her tears. And I won't look at the big woman nor the boy. Then I'll stay. So Polly kissed her, and pretty soon Mrs. Beebe bustled in, her round face quite red with the extra she had been making, and Mrs. Beebe, having seen to his horse, came in rubbing his hands worse than ever, saying, "Now if we only had Joel, we'd be all right." "Now, my dears," began Mrs. Beebe, "why, you ain't laid up your things yet," to the Peppers. "No," said Polly, "but we will now. Thank you, Mrs. Beebe," and she untied Phronsie's sunbonnet and took off the shawl, David putting his cap down on the counter, keeping a sharp, disapproving eye on Ab'm every minute. "When are you coming for a new pair of shoes?" whispered Mrs. Beebe, getting hold of Phronsie and lifting her to his knee. Phronsie thrust out her little foot. "See," she cried gleefully, forgetting a moment about the big woman and the boy. "They're nice, Mr. Beebe. They're all here." Then she poked out the outer foot. "I buttoned 'em up all myself." "No," cried Mr. Beebe, greatly delighted. "Well, now, when those are worn out, you come and see me again, will you?" "They aren't ever going to be worn out," said Phronsie, positively, shaking her head. "Oh, ho!" laughed Ab'm, suddenly finding his tongue. "Your shoes ain't never goin' to wear out, Ma. Did you hear her?" Phronsie started and hid her face on Mr. Beebe's fat shoulder. Polly hurried to her side. "Be still," cried his mother. "Ain't you no manners, and they're company? Ab'm Bennett, I'm ashamed of ye." With that, she leaned over and gave him a box on the ear. It was perfectly dreadful, and Polly had all she could do to keep bursting out crying. And what they would have done, no one knows. And if Mrs. Beebe hadn't said, "Won't you all walk out into the parlor and sit down to the table? Come, Pa, you lead with Phronsie." "Ab'm oughter," said his mother. "That's style, seeing the party for his birthday." "Well, you goin' first then, Martherina?" said old Mr. Beebe dryly. "With him and Phronsie, and I'll foller on. Now then, my dear." He set her on the floor and bent his old white head down to smile into her face reassuringly, while her trembling fingers held his hand fast. "Polly Pepper, Polly Pepper," said little David, as they brought up the rear of the procession. "I'm so very much afraid of that boy." "The party will soon be through," said Polly, encouragingly. I'm so glad that Joel isn't here, for he'd say something. And I'm afraid if Ab'm scares Phronsie again," and she gave a sigh of relief. Oh, the table, there were doughnuts. Sure enough, as Mrs. Martherine had said, the biggest I ever see, and the sugarest. No wonder good Mrs. Beebe got up at 4 o'clock to make 'em. and a great dish of pink and white sticks and cunning little biscuits with real butter in them, and a cake with little round candies sprinkled all over the top. Was there ever so much a beautiful birthday party? Phronsie, clinging to good Mrs. Beebe's hand, thought not, and her glances wandered all up and down in delight, to bring her eyes at last up to Phronsie's ones, when her little face broke into a happy smile. Abram was so intent on choosing which of the pink and white sticks he should pick, for that he could think of nothing else. So Mrs. Beebe got them all seated without any further trouble. Old Mr. Beebe was just saying, "Now, if Joel was only here, we'd be all right," when the shop door opened suddenly, and into the little parlor ran Joel, very red in the face. "Now that's nice enough," cried Mrs. Beebe, getting out of her chair, her pink cap ribbons in a flutter, while old Mr. exclaimed with a beaming face, "Well, I declare, if I'm glad to see you. Sit right down by me." "Now he'll sit here, Pa," said Mrs. Beebe, pushing up the chair next to Abram. "There's more room this side." So Joel marched and got into his seat. "And so you thought you'd come," said Mrs. Beebe with a jolly laugh. "Now we'll have fine times, won't we, Phronsie?" patting her hand. "How'd you get it?" "I walked," said Joel, who couldn't for his life keep his eyes from the doughnuts. "Except when I met a man with a load of hay, and he was so slow, I got down again, for I was afraid I'd miss the party." chuckled Mr. Beebe. "Well, wife, do you give Joel a doughnut? He must be tired of coming so far." "Oh, thank you," cried Joel, thrusting out his hand eagerly. "'Tain't style where I come out from the West to help the doughnuts first, and 'specially when that's the boy just come," said Mrs. Martharina, with a great air. Joel dropped his dough to his plate as if he had been a hot cake, and leaned over to fasten his black eyes on her big face. "Well, pass the biscuits, do then," said old Mrs. Beebe. Mr. Beebe good-naturedly. "Let's get something goin', Ma." So the little biscuits were passed, but Joel did not take one. He still sat regarding Abram's mother. "Ma," said Abram, with a loud whisper, and twitching her elbow, "the strange boy's a-lookin' at you all the time. Make him stop, do." At this, Phronsie gave a little cry. "Don't let him burst her joy," she gasped, turning to Mr. Beebe. "There shan't nothin' hurt Joel. Don't you be afraid," he whispered back. "Ho, ho!" cried Abram, pointing a big fat finger at her. "That might have been cleaner. Hear her now. And she said her shoes weren't never goin' to wear out. Ho, ho!" "You let our Phronsie alone," screamed Joel, tearing his black eyes off from Mrs. Marthy's face to fasten them on her son. "Ow! He pinched me!" roared Abram, edging suddenly off to his mother. "I did not," cried Joel, stoutly. "I didn't touch him a single bit. But he shan't scare Phronsie, or I'll pinch into him. Yes, sirree!" "Joel!" cried Polly, in great distress, across the table. "Well, he shan't scare Phronsie," cried Joel. "This boy shan't, or I will pinch into him." And his black eyes blazed, and he doubled up his little brown fist. "Joel," commanded Polly, "do you stop this very minute. And, oh, sir!" looking up at Mr. Beebe, and, "oh, Marm!" and her brown eyes were fixed imploringly on Mrs. Beebe's round countenance. "I do feel ashamed, and Mamsie will be so sorry. But please, will you let us go home?" And poor Polly could say no more. "And I should think you'd better go home," said Abram's mother with asperity. "Comin' to a birthday party and abusin' the boy, it's give for. I never see the like. And to think how I'll drive you over here, and the horse most runnin' away all the time." Polly got out of her chair and sorrowfully went up to Joel. "We'll sit out in the shop, if you please, dear Mr. and Mrs. Beebe, till you get through the party, and then, if you please, we'd like to go home." Joel's head dropped, and little brown fists fell down. "I'm sorry," he mumbled. Mrs. Beebe picked off the biggest pink stick from the pile on the dish and slid it on Joel's plate. "Eat that," she whispered. "Abram's goin' home in a week, and then, says I, you shall come over and visit with me." And Mr. Beebe looked over at him and nodded his white head, and Joel was quite sure he winked pleasantly at him. But the pink stick and doughnut lay quiet, untouched, on his plate, and after a time, Polly having crept back to her seat, the biscuits had been passed around again, and the grand cake, with candies on top, had been cut. The pink and white sticks were divided, and the doughnuts went up and down the table. And lo and behold, the party was over. "I've had a birthday party," said Abram, with great satisfaction, sliding out of his chair with a black look for Joel, and putting what he couldn't eat into his pocket. "You come with me," said Mrs. Beebe to Joel, "and let all the others go back into the shop." So she followed her into a little entry, and out of that opened a cupboard. "Now there's a paper bag up on that shelf," said Mrs. Beebe. "You can climb up and get it. That's right. Now, says I." She waddled back to the supper table. "Come here, Joel, my boy, and hold it open. There. In went the biggest doughnuts that were left, some little biscuits, several pieces of the fine cake, and last of all, 3 or 4 pink and white sticks. "You tell your ma," said Mrs. Beebe, speaking very soft, "that Mr. Beebe and me thinks a sight of you, and that you're a-comin' out here to spend the day just as soon as Abram goes. Now remember." "Yes, I will," said Joel, twisting up his bag. "And I'll come, Mrs. Beebe, if Mamsie let me." "And take care the things don't fall out," warned Mrs. Beebe. Joel gave the bag with another twist and gripped it fast. I guess Pa's got the horse around all right," said Mrs. Beebe, going out into the shop. "So I suppose you must all go. Though sorry to have you." She gave Polly a motherly little on the shoulder, and fairly cried over Phronsie. "Well, you've got to go, I s'pose," she said again, "'cause Pa's waitin'. Jess, Pa," she called, "they're comin'," and presently the little Peppers, except Phronsie, all clambered over the wheel. Then Polly and Joel lifted her up, and away they went, Mrs. Beebe watching them off till a turn of the narrow street hid them from view. "That Abram," said Mr. Beebe, after they had gone quite a piece, and glancing back over his shoulder, "well, he ain't really to kin to us, thank the Lord, and they're goin' next week. I can tell you one thing, Polly, he ain't his ma don't get inside our house again." End of chapter 6. Read by Elijah Fisher.